ripped from their homes, chained like animals, and crammed into a filthy ship where the air is thick with fear and despair. This was the brutal reality of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans faced unimaginable horror as they were forced across the Atlantic, leaving everything they knew behind. A long time ago, many people from Africa were taken away from their homes against their will. This was called the transatlantic slave trade. It was a very sad and terrible time because families were torn apart, and people had to leave everything they loved behind. Imagine you are playing happily with your friends when suddenly strangers come, capture you, and take you far away. This happened to many African people. These strangers were called slave traders. They would capture people from different parts of Africa, like West Africa, Central Africa, and other regions. Sometimes, they tricked people or fought with villages to take them. Once captured, the people were tied up and forced to walk long distances to the coast. This walk was called a death march, because it was very hard and many didn't survive. Those who made it were kept in dark, crowded places called slave forts. These forts were like prisons by the sea, and people stayed there for weeks or even months before being sent away. After staying in the forts, the captured people were forced onto big ships. These ships would take them across the ocean to places far away, like the Americas. This journey was called the Middle Passage. It was one of the worst parts of the slave trade. Inside the ships, the people were crammed together with barely any space to move. They were chained to each other and had to lie down because there wasn't enough room to sit or stand. The ships were dirty and smelled terrible. Many people got very sick because they couldn't breathe fresh air or move around. Sometimes, there was not enough food or clean water, and many people died on the way. The ones who survived were often very weak and sad. They missed their families and their homes so much. Even though everything seemed hopeless, many Africans stayed strong in their hearts. They sang songs from their villages to keep their spirits up. Sometimes they prayed and whispered stories from home to each other. These small acts of hope helped them survive the terrible journey. People from different places, who spoke different languages, learned to help each other. They shared what little they had and tried to protect one another. Their courage and kindness gave them strength, even when they were scared. The enslaved Africans faced terrible hardships, but they never stopped dreaming of freedom. Their hearts were full of courage, and many of them found ways to fight back. Some tried to escape, while others bravely stood up to their captors. Their spirit of resistance showed that even in the darkest times, hope and bravery could still shine. While crossing the ocean, some Africans tried to take control of the ships. This was very dangerous because the sailors had weapons, and the Africans were often chained. Still, they would whisper plans to each other, waiting for the right moment to act. One of the most famous ship rebellions happened on a ship called the Amistad. The people on board were from Africa and had been captured and forced onto the ship. One brave man named Sink became their leader. One night, he and the others broke free from their chains. They fought the crew and took over the ship, hoping to sail back home. Unfortunately, they didn't know how to navigate the sea. The sailors tricked them and sailed to America instead. When they arrived, Sink and the others were put on trial. Many people thought they should be punished, but kind supporters helped tell their story. In the end, the court decided that they were kidnapped people fighting for their freedom, not criminals. They were allowed to return to Africa. When the long, hard journey on the ships finally ended, the Africans were taken off the ships and sold to other people who wanted to make them work without pay. They were taken to places where they would be forced to work. These places were called plantations, and they were large farms where crops like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee were grown. The people who owned these plantations were called masters, and they treated the Africans like property rather than human beings. The enslaved Africans had no choice but to work from sunrise to sunset, often without rest. They had to dig the soil, plant seeds, and take care of the crops as they grew. Once the crops were ready, they harvested them by hand, which was hard, back-breaking work. The work was extremely tiring, and the weather was often hot. The overseers, men who watched over the workers, were cruel and would whip anyone who slowed down or tried to rest. Sometimes, even children had to work, picking cotton or carrying heavy loads. Enslaved Africans had to wake up before the sun rose and worked until it was too dark to see. They ate very little and wore clothes that were often old and torn. If they got sick or too tired, they were not allowed to rest. Instead, they were forced to keep working, no matter how weak they felt. Not everyone worked in the fields. Some Africans were forced to work inside their masters' homes. They cleaned, cooked, and took care of the master's children. Even though they were indoors, they were not treated kindly. They had to be very careful not to make any mistakes, or they would be punished. Some were skilled workers, like blacksmiths or carpenters, but even their talents did not protect them from harsh treatment. No matter where they worked, they were still treated as less than human. The enslaved Africans were expected to obey without question. If they did not do what the master wanted, they were beaten or whipped. The masters wanted to control every part of their lives. They did not allow them to practice their own culture freely or speak their own languages. To make them feel powerless, masters tried to break their spirits. They gave them new names, different from their African names, so they would forget where they came from. But the enslaved people found ways to keep their identity alive by whispering songs and stories to one another. Sadly, it wasn't just the hard work and harsh punishments that made life unbearable. Many enslaved African women and even young girls were treated very badly by their masters. These women had no control over their own lives, and the masters would force them into uncomfortable and painful situations. The masters believed they owned not just the work but also the bodies of the enslaved people. They would force women to have children, hoping to increase the number of workers on the plantation. This was deeply hurtful and took away the women's right to choose what happened to them. The women could not say no or protect themselves because refusing meant being beaten or even killed. This kind of mistreatment made many feel hopeless, but they still tried to protect their dignity by staying strong in spirit. Sometimes, when babies were born from these forced situations, the children were still treated as slaves. They never got to know freedom, and their mothers had to watch as they grew up in the same harsh conditions. This kind of treatment left many enslaved women feeling sad and ashamed, even though it was not their fault. They comforted each other as best as they could, forming bonds of friendship to help them survive. The women would sing songs that carried hidden messages, sharing their pain without saying it directly. Not only did enslaved Africans fight on ships, but they also fought on the land where they were forced to work. On big farms called plantations, people had to work very hard all day with little rest. The overseers would watch them closely and punish anyone who disobeyed. But some enslaved Africans couldn't take it anymore. They decided to fight back, even if it was risky. In places like Haiti, people gathered secretly to plan revolts. A brave leader named Toussaint Louverture helped start a revolution. The enslaved people fought hard, and after many battles, they won their freedom. Haiti became the first country where enslaved people successfully fought and gained independence. There were other uprisings, too. In the United States, a man named Nat Turner led a rebellion. He and others fought for their freedom, even though they knew it could cost their lives. These acts of bravery show that the human spirit could not be completely crushed. Some Africans chose to run away rather than fight. This was also very dangerous because there were people called slave catchers who would try to bring them back. To escape, they had to be smart and quiet, traveling at night and hiding during the day. There were special secret routes called the Underground Railroad that helped escaping Africans find safe places. Even though it wasn't a real railroad, it worked like one because it had many stops where people could rest and eat. Brave helpers called conductors guided them from one safe house to another. One famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. She had escaped from slavery herself and went back many times to help others. She never lost a single person she guided, and people admired her courage. Harriet would sing softly to let the others know it was safe to move. Her songs were full of hope and helped them keep going. Some Africans who managed to escape didn't just keep running. Instead, they built communities where they could live safely. In Brazil, there was a famous community called Quilombo dos Palmares. It was hidden deep in the mountains and lasted for many years. The people there farmed, danced, and kept their African traditions alive. Another place where escaped Africans gathered was in Jamaica, where they formed Maroon communities. These groups lived far from cities, making it hard for anyone to find them. They grew their own food and lived as freely as possible. Even when they couldn't escape, many Africans found other ways to resist. They would sing songs that seemed cheerful but were actually full of hidden messages about running away. These songs were called spirituals. Singing together made them feel strong and connected, reminding them that they were not alone. They also told stories from Africa to teach their children about courage and kindness. Sometimes, the stories were about clever animals like Anansi the spider, who used his wits to overcome challenges. These tales made them feel connected to their homeland, even when they were far away. The enslaved Africans refused to forget their roots. They braided their hair in patterns that reminded them of maps from home. They cooked food that tasted like the meals they used to share with their families. Even when forced to adopt new customs, they kept parts of their own culture alive in secret. Their determination to hold on to their identity was a form of resistance too. It showed that, no matter what, they would not let go of who they were. There were also free Africans and allies who spoke out against slavery. One man named Frederick Douglass had been enslaved but escaped. He became a great speaker and writer, telling people why slavery was wrong. His words inspired many to join the fight for freedom. Another woman named Sojourner Truth traveled around giving powerful speeches. She talked about how everyone deserved to be free, no matter their skin color. Her bravery helped change people's minds and made them see that slavery was unfair. The transatlantic slave trade hurt Africa in many ways. It was not just the people who were taken that suffered, entire communities and countries were affected. Even today, we still feel the effects of what happened back then. Let's talk about how the slave trade changed African societies, from losing so many people to the way cultures were disrupted and affected. When the slave traders came to Africa, they didn't just take a few people, they took millions. Most of the people captured were young, strong men and women. These were the people who worked on farms, hunted, built houses, and took care of their families. Imagine if most of the young people in your town were taken away. Who would help the elders? Who would grow the food? Who would protect the village? This is what happened to many communities in Africa. They became weaker because the people who did the hardest work were gone. In some villages, families were completely broken. Mothers lost their children, brothers lost sisters, and friends lost one another. The sadness was everywhere because no one knew if they would see their loved ones again. Some villages became almost empty, and others had to work much harder to survive. When so many people were taken, it wasn't just families that suffered, whole communities changed. Some communities that were once big and full of life became small and quiet. There weren't enough people to do the jobs that kept the village running. The people left behind had to do twice as much work, which made life very hard. Sometimes, neighboring villages would fight over the few resources left. Instead of helping each other, they became scared and suspicious, worrying that they too would be captured. The slave traders didn't just capture people by themselves. Sometimes, they made deals with local leaders, giving them weapons or goods in exchange for capturing people from rival tribes. This caused fighting between groups that once lived peacefully. Some leaders felt forced to make these deals because they didn't want their own people to be captured. They thought that if they helped the traders, their own families would be safe. But this created mistrust among the tribes. Friendships turned into rivalries, and old allies became enemies. When the young and skilled people were taken away, many important skills were lost. These were people who knew how to build strong houses, grow crops, make beautiful crafts, and heal the sick with natural remedies. Without them, traditions started to fade. Younger children didn't get to learn from their older siblings or parents because they were gone. The special ways of doing things that made each community unique began to disappear. African societies were full of rich traditions, songs, dances, and stories that were passed from one generation to the next. But when the slave trade took so many people, it was like breaking a chain that held all these stories and traditions together. Some of the captured Africans tried to keep their culture alive when they were taken to faraway places. They sang songs from home and taught their children stories from their villages. But many things were lost because families were split up, and people from different tribes were mixed together. Back in Africa, festivals became quieter, and some dances were forgotten because the people who knew them were no longer there. The special ways of worship and celebrating life became harder to keep alive. Before the slave trade, many African communities were peaceful and focused on family and farming. But with the constant fear of being captured, people started to change how they lived. Some moved to hidden places like mountains or dense forests to stay safe. Others built stronger defenses around their villages. Trade between communities also changed. People were afraid to travel far from home because they didn't want to be kidnapped. This meant that sharing goods and ideas became less common, and some communities became more isolated. African communities were used to trading goods like gold, spices, cloth, and food. But when the slave trade became more common, some leaders started focusing on trading people instead of goods. This changed the way money and wealth were seen. Instead of growing their communities, some leaders got rich by working with the slave traders. This kind of economy did not help the community as a whole. Instead, it caused even more harm because it made the villages weaker. Even after the slave trade ended, the sadness stayed. People who survived the terrible events passed down stories of loss and pain to their children. Some families never found out what happened to their loved ones, and that feeling of not knowing hurt deeply. Many people also felt guilty, like the leaders who made deals with traders or the villagers who couldn't protect their own. This guilt and pain made it hard for some communities to heal, even long after the trade was over. Despite all the pain and loss, African societies showed great strength. The people who remained worked hard to rebuild their communities. They planted new crops, taught new generations, and tried to bring back the traditions that were almost lost. They remembered the stories of those who had been taken and kept their memories alive. New songs and stories were created to honor the people who had fought for freedom and resisted capture. To make sure that no one would forget what happened, elders told stories to children about the past. They wanted future generations to know about the strength and bravery of their ancestors. They taught them that no matter how hard things got, their spirit could never be broken. Despite the deep scars left by the transatlantic slave trade, the resilience of African communities shines through. Through pain and loss, they rebuilt, preserving their culture and spirit for generations to come. Today, we honor their strength and remember the stories that still echo through the ages.